As I said at the beginning of the service, I'm delighted that so many of you chose to join us this morning. Just like last Sunday on Mother's Day, I know a lot of people who make the conscious decision to skip church when the talk turns to finances and stewardship, especially in the fall. There seems to be a little drop-off during that time of the year in church attendance. But of course, the biblical concept of stewardship is not only about money. When you join a United Methodist Church these days, you make a vow, a fivefold vow, to give of your prayers, your presence, your gifts, your service, and your witness. So that means that we promise to give faithfully to God of our time and talents, our finances, our physical acts, and even our own life stories to share what God is doing in our lives. But we'll save that broader discussion of all the 5 parts for this fall. I wouldn't want you to have an excuse to skip church now, would I? And this morning, I want to focus on one specific point, just on the money. Now, not just the green stuff, but what we have and what we give and how it makes us feel or why we do it. This is the final in our 5-week series on Post-Easter Uprising. It was only 5 weeks ago when we celebrated here in this church Jesus Christ rising from the dead after being hung on a cross like that. Jesus Christ showing us that there is life after death, that there are new beginnings offered all the time. And so in these past weeks, we've been talking about what rises up in us because of the gift and the sacrifice that Christ made. We began in the first week with the uprising of belief, taking baby steps from our needs for religious certainty, away from that and into the embracing of God's mysterious and bottomless love for us. And as we each grow in belief individually, we also long to spend time with other believers in fellowship, experiencing the community of Christ on our own skins, sharing our own lives. After fellowship, we discussed discipleship, the recognition of our need for a teacher, not necessarily a person with fancy degrees or an education, but someone who can cook breakfast for us, just like Jesus did for the disciples on the Galilean lakeshore, and who taught us what being a disciple means. And as our discipleship, as our study grows, and our eagerness to learn grows, we begin to actually take ownership in the church. We begin to be partners with God in this work that God is doing in our world. And God asks us to pony up, as I mentioned last week, not just with our time and our talents, but also with that which is in our wallets. Now, I was raised in South Carolina, and I was told as a child that you never discuss sex and money at the dinner table. It was impolite. So it's a good thing that none of you are eating this morning. You see, as I told the kids, Jesus talked about money more than any other topic while he was alive on this earth, save for the topic, the kingdom of God. He wanted to give them something to look forward to. But after instilling that hope and encouraging them, the first thing that he wanted them to get right in their lives was the way that they looked at, perceived, and dealt with their own finances. So I'm just going to ignore my southern upbringing and dive right in this morning. And I hope you don't mind jumping into the wave with me. Because when Jesus talked in parables to teach, he shared 39 parables. And of those, 11 were about finances. They were about money. And what's important to note about his money teachings is not the causes to which we should give. Jesus doesn't specify, but what he does talk about is our motivation for giving. In today's text, Paul is urging the church at Corinth, which is filled with recent Gentile converts to the faith, to fulfill their pledge to give money to the poor Jewish people in Jerusalem. Now, if you'll remember a few weeks back in our study about the eunuch, Gentiles were not always welcome in the temple courts in Jerusalem. And yet in Jerusalem there were many hungry people. And so as the disciples traveled out into the world and helped convert people to Christianity, they asked those people to give money for poor people in Jerusalem. The church at Corinth didn't know these Jewish people. They didn't know what their circumstances were. They couldn't verify their need by checking all their documents and making sure that they were telling the truth about the fact that they were hungry or not. They were asked to simply give generously because God had given to them. Now, Paul is not asking for money to fund his own mission trips, nor is he asking the Corinthians to feed their own local widows and the sick and the poor. That's, of course, part of what it meant to be a Christian in those days, but Paul is asking them to do more, to stretch outside their comfort zones, outside their circle, outside their reach, and to give generously to these people whom they've never seen. And he doesn't even have the heart-wrenching full-color photos that today's nonprofits offer when you agree to feed a hungry child in India or help to buy a well in Africa. They weren't even getting that feel-good sensation of what their money directly would go for. But to encourage generosity in Corinth, he shares the story of a nearby church, the church in Macedonia, the church that we discovered the beginnings of last Sunday, Lydia and her household, who were all baptized at the river, and whose first act was to show hospitality to the disciples, to welcome them into her home. Now, this little church, it says, has fallen on hard times. This group of believers had fierce troubles, which had pushed them to their limits, the text says. They had literally hit rock bottom. Now, we don't know if Lydia's purple dye house had gone under or if the Silk Road had changed directions to bypass them. But for whatever reason, they were living in very desperate times. And the text says they were desperately poor. Now, in the first century, desperately poor, poverty didn't mean that you had to cancel your DirecTV or your smartphone contract like it does today. Poverty in that century meant that you weren't sure when or if you would eat again. And so it is to these people who are unsure about where their next meal will come from that Paul speaks. And in this most desperate time of their lives, they don't give up on their newfound faith. They rally around others who are poor and hungry, and they give generously of the money that they have in order to feed people that they don't know. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a huge step of faith, to give expecting that God will take care of you. And I wonder how many of us today can do that, can say that we do the same. Can we open our hearts and our checkbooks and our date books and give freely and abundantly and generously of our time and our gifts and our money? Do we really expect God to honor that gift and to fill in the gaps? It's a difficult question. It's a question that I'm sure many of you wrestle with, just like I do, each time when I write a check. These Christians in Macedonia, they trusted that God would see their generosity and would reward them and would make sure that they didn't go hungry. They trusted, it says, because they first believed in God and gave themselves wholly to God and to God's disciples. They acted first. They took a great risk, and their risk yielded great rewards. Like the widow who gave the only 2 coins which she had in the New Testament text, this Macedonian church gave spontaneously and sacrificially, the text says. They gave out of a heart overflowing with love for God and others. They decided to open their hands, to let go of their control, which enabled them to receive God's blessings. Their lives were primed and ready to be filled with abundant love and grace. And God definitely overflowed their lives with that grace. He made them able to be there when the chains broke off Paul's and Silas's wrists. He gave them a place of solace to offer community and help to those who were hurting. He strengthened these people individually and as a community because of their faith in action. Now, I have a friend who's an associate pastor in one of the largest and richest urban churches in Colorado. Their annual budget is almost $2 million. And recently they successfully completed a long-range strategic plan. And still, they noticed a budget shortfall. They felt a stagnation within the congregation, even though they had beautifully renovated facilities and exciting new programs for people of all ages. And so they hired business consultants to come in and help them determine what the problem was. The study that the consultants did gave some startling results. Over 90% of the congregation was extremely satisfied with the church and the mission and the programs. And yet, the majority of the congregation gave less than 1% of their income to the church. They said with their mouths how happy they were to be in this fellowship, but when you looked at their checkbooks, they gave more to other charitable organizations like the Humane Society, which is a great organization, or other organizations than they did to the church. And so the consultant shared these results with the senior pastor. And that week, the senior pastor, who was nervous about speaking about money, challenged her congregation publicly to make up the almost $100,000 shortfall. Or else they'd have to begin cutting positions, cutting programs, scaling back their ministry. And she offered to do that if that's what the people wanted. Because after all, it was their church. They owned it. They were partners in mission. And within 4 weeks, that church had made up a $100,000 budget shortfall. Wow. I don't know, and my friend said it was kind of a mystery because it wasn't just the fact that her job was no longer on the chopping block. It was also the fact that young families started coming to the church. People started giving and volunteering of their time. People started noticing and caring about each other, asking one another out to lunch afterwards, getting to know one another in the fellowship of Christ. They saw themselves as co-owners, as business partners, as servants in this mission of the church together. And something about their outward action changed something inside of them and the way that they felt about the people in the pews around them. My friend said that she and her husband gave 3% of her income, and they felt so challenged by this message that they agreed to give 1% each year until they got up to 10%, the normal tithing amount that's often talked about from the pulpits. I'm going to save you all the biblical scriptures on tithing this morning and just ask you, have you ever looked at your checkbook, at your monthly budget, to see what percentage of your funds go to what areas? I know when Regis and I first got married, we did this, and it was very telling that our entertainment often took place in restaurants and bars where we like to hang out and meet our friends, where other people spent money on baseball games or movies. That was how we spent our free time, and that said something about us. And how we spend our money in the church also says something about us. Many people today live in nice homes, but we don't know what's on the inside, the discussions that take place around their kitchen tables. We don't know about people's debt. We don't know about people's fear, about how much energy it takes to accumulate goods and to hang on to those goods and to care for those goods. And we don't know what goes on behind closed doors. And so in this big urban church, as people began to talk about where they were in their giving cycle and what they wanted to give, true changes were made within the community. They changed from attitudes of fear about how to hold on to and maximize what they had to attitudes of freedom about how they could give generously and expect God to show up and fill in the gaps. Fundamentally, they were each changed as individuals, and therefore the church was also changed. This changed who showed up on Sunday mornings, who became a part of their fellowship, and how connected they each felt to the wider mission of the global church. You see, the church at Corinth, it says, trusted God, and those people were articulate and insightful and passionate, and they loved Paul and the missionaries, but they needed to go one step further towards being a part of God's wider mission. They had given themselves unreservedly to God and to one another, but now that giving simply needed to flow out of God's work and into the lives of others. I don't know about you, I don't believe that money is evil, but I do believe that to whom much is given, much is expected. And I think John Wesley said it best, earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. You see, he started a little revival movement in the Church of England that became United Methodism, the tradition which we are a part of today. And he died nearly penniless, although he preached the gospel all around the world. It's not about our world's idea of consumerism or of leaving a legacy. The church's idea, Jesus' idea about money, is about living your legacy while you're here on earth. And I wonder, what would it feel like to plead for the privilege of helping out the relief of the poor? That's what the text says. These people in poverty, they pleaded for the privilege to do God's work. Not just a few bucks on the street corner to someone in need, or a nominal Christmas gift, or tax season time donation made to some charitable organization, but a wave of generosity, just like the one pictured on the front of your bulletin today. What would that feel like? And how might living in God's flow change our lives, our checkbooks, and our ability to act spontaneously in whatever way the Spirit leads? Amen.